Getting your 3-blind average down to under a minute can be difficult, but it's also very satisfying. In this video, I'll be going over how to do it. Part 1. Method. When it comes to what method you use to become sub 1, there are 3 main options and they're all pretty good. M2OP is the most popular method of these 3. With M2 edges, you set up pieces to UB, then swap DF and UB using an M2. With OP corners, you set up pieces to RDF, then swap UBL and RDF using a modified Y-perm. M2 Orozco. You still use M2 to solve edges, but now you use Orozco for corners instead. This has the advantage of solving pieces using shorter algorithms, but it involves more thinking since you have both a buffer and a helper. Orozco. Now you're using Orozco for both edges and corners. This method isn't very popular since Orozco isn't much faster than M2 for edges, but some people like using it as a transition to 3-style. Of course you can use 3-style if you want, but it's not necessary to become sub 1. Part 2. Memorization. Memorization should take about 30 seconds. If you're going for sub 1, you should already be familiar with your orientation and lettering scheme, so you don't have to think much about which piece is which letter. If you're not familiar yet, practice a lot until you are. But other than being comfortable with your lettering scheme, one of the most important things you can do to memorize faster is to create a letter pair sheet. By having a letter pair sheet, you don't have to waste mental energy or time thinking of words on the fly. You can copy someone else's sheet, but I strongly recommend making your own as it will help you learn the words and become familiar with them. ColPy is a great resource to make a letter pair sheet with as it provides multiple word options for each pair. If you're not already using CEEC order, switch to it. Basically, you memorize corners, then memorize edges, then execute edges, then execute corners. By doing this, you can store corners in long-term memory and edges in short-term memory since you don't have to remember edges for as long. For corners, you should memorize using images and really visualize what you memorize. This helps the memorization stick longer. For edges, you should use audio memo. You basically take 2 letters, stick a vowel between them if necessary, and then just remember the sound of that word. Since you're memorizing gibberish a lot of the time, audio memo isn't nearly as memorable, but it's a lot faster than images. Review is highly subjective for sub 1, but you want to try to minimize the number of times you review. My personal system when I was averaging about 50 seconds was to memorize corners, review corners, memorize edges, quickly review edges, then execute. As I got faster, I cut down on reviews until I was 1-passing, which is not reviewing at all. 1-passing isn't really useful until you learn 3-style, so don't worry about it for now. Part 3. Execution. For sub 1 minute, your execution doesn't have to be great as long as you're using one of the methods I mentioned earlier. The biggest thing in exec is reducing pauses, which really just comes down to practice. If you choose to use Orozco, you'll have to get used to switching between the helper and the buffer, which can take some time. However, you don't need high TPS. If you memorize in 30 seconds, you have 30 seconds left for execution. Let's suppose that you use M2 Orozco and your average solution length is 180 moves. That means on average you only need 6 TPS, which isn't as hard as it sounds. There's not that much to talk about for execution, so let's just move on to the next section. Part 4. Techniques. There are a lot of things you can do to get faster at 3x3 Blindfolded, and I'm going to cover some of the more important ones. For example, one of them is learning a 2-flip algorithm that you can set up to. When you encounter a flipped edge in Memo, it's a lot faster to do an algorithm to solve it rather than shooting your buffer to both sides of it. The same thing goes for 2-twists. Either setting up to a ZBLL or doing a beginner's method type of solution is a lot faster than shooting to 2 sides of the corner. Another small improvement is using wide moves in M2. Rather than rotating and setting up the piece like this, it's faster to use wide moves instead. And of course, I have to mention the not done. It only saves less than 1/4 of a second, but it looks cool, so hey, that's something, right?